The first-class cabin of Flight 209 from New York to Los Angeles hummed with quiet chatter, the clinking of glasses, and the faint rustle of newspapers. Plush leather seats, warm ambient lighting, and the soft hum of the aircraft created an air of exclusivity, where the rich and powerful settled in for the 5-hour journey. Among the passengers was Tom Cruise, dressed casually in a fitted black hoodie, jeans, and aviator sunglasses tucked into his collar. Despite his global fame, he had mastered the art of blending in. He sat near the window, scrolling through his phone, seemingly just another passenger. A few rows ahead, Rebecca Miller, a plus-sized woman in her early 40s, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her brown eyes darted around nervously, as if she didn't belong in the opulent first-class section. Her fingers clutched the armrests, and her breathing was shallow, a telltale sign of someone who wasn't a frequent flyer. She had saved for months to afford this flight, upgrading her seat as a personal milestone. But now, with the judgmental glances thrown her way, she wasn't sure if she had made the right choice. The discomfort wasn't just psychological. The seat felt tight. She adjusted her belt, trying not to invade the space of the man seated next to her, a businessman in a pressed suit who had already given her a disapproving once-over. That's when the trouble started. A flight attendant, a tall blonde woman with a crisp uniform and an air of superiority, approached Rebecca. Her name tag read Catherine. She had the poised confidence of someone who had worked first class for years, but her eyes held a sharpness that was far from welcoming. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice, but ensuring others could still hear. "Ma'am," she said, her tone polite but laced with condescension. "Are you sure you're seated correctly? First class is reserved for premium ticket holders." Rebecca swallowed hard, her cheeks burning. She had paid for this seat. She knew what the flight attendant was implying, that she looked out of place. "Yes," she said, forcing a smile. "This is my seat." Catherine pursed her lips, clearly not convinced. She tapped the seat's touchscreen, checking Rebecca's booking details. A moment later, she let out a small theatrical sigh. "All right," she said. "But just so you know, these seats are designed with certain comfort parameters. If you find it too snug, I can look into reassigning you to a more accommodating section." Rebecca's heart pounded in her chest, as the snickers around her seemed to echo in her ears. She had felt this type of judgment before. At restaurants when waiters subtly raised an eyebrow at her order. In clothing stores where sales associates steered her toward the plus-size section without asking. And now here, in the luxurious first-class cabin, where she had every right to be. She forced herself to sit tall, gripping the armrests tighter. The businessman beside her cleared his throat, shifting slightly as if to put more space between them. Not that there was much room to spare. His body language screamed discomfort. Catherine, the flight attendant, wasn't done. She leaned in a little closer, speaking in a voice that was syrupy sweet, but sharp as a blade. "I'm just trying to ensure your comfort, ma'am. You know, first-class seating has certain proportions. We wouldn't want you to feel squeezed in for the whole flight. It's a long journey." Rebecca felt a lump form in her throat. She had expected kindness on this trip. Maybe even the excitement of treating herself to a rare luxury. Not this. "I'm fine," she managed, her voice steady but soft. Catherine's lips curled into a tight smile, as if she was enjoying the small power trip. She turned on her heel, stepping away, but not before casting one last glance at Rebecca, a silent, smug warning. Rebecca swallowed hard and looked out the window, hoping the view of the endless sky would ground her emotions. But she wasn't the only one who had been paying attention. Tom Cruise watched everything. He had seen the way Catherine angled her body, not in genuine concern, but in a way designed to make Rebecca feel small. He had caught the businessman's shift, the suppressed chuckles from a few rows back, and the way Rebecca had shrunk into herself, even when she had every right to be here. He knew that look, the look of someone fighting a battle in silence. Tom was no stranger to high society. He knew exactly how people in power, people with status, could weaponize politeness to humiliate others. He had spent decades in the public eye, watching how some people judged based on appearances alone. And he also knew that there was nothing he hated more than a bully. He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back. This wasn't going to stand, but he wasn't going to cause a scene. Not yet. Instead, he reached for the call button and pressed it. Catherine's day was about to take a turn she never saw coming. He words hit Rebecca like a slap. A more accommodating section? She knew exactly what Catherine meant. Economy. The businessman beside her shifted uncomfortably, pretending to be absorbed in his tablet, while a few other passengers snickered under their breath. Rebecca clenched her fists, willing herself to stay composed. She had fought for her self-worth for years, and she wasn't about to crumble now. Tom Cruise, sitting just a few seats away, lowered his phone. His sharp eyes, hidden behind a casual gaze, had caught every detail of the interaction. He didn't like what he was seeing, and he was about to do the unthinkable. The soft chime of the call button echoed through the first-class cabin. Passengers barely noticed, too busy sipping their complimentary champagne or adjusting their silk sleep masks. But Catherine, the flight attendant, froze mid-stride. Her eyes flickered toward the seat where the call had come from. Seat 3A. Tom Cruise. A ripple of nervous energy coursed through her veins. Celebrities flew first class all the time, but this was Tom Cruise. A global icon. A man whose name carried power in every room he entered. She took a breath, straightened her uniform, and approached his seat with a perfectly rehearsed smile. "Mr. Cruise, how can I assist you today?" she asked, her voice now dripping with a respect noticeably absent just moments ago. Tom looked up from his seat, his expression calm but unreadable. He wasn't the type to make a scene. He didn't need to. His mere presence commanded attention. He tilted his head slightly, nodding toward Rebecca without breaking eye contact with Catherine. "I'd like to switch seats," he said simply. Rebecca's head snapped toward him, her brown eyes wide with surprise. Catherine blinked, clearly thrown off. "Excuse me? I want to sit here," Tom repeated, tapping the armrest of Rebecca's seat. "Move my seat assignment to 2B. The request hung in the air like an unexpected plot twist. A few passengers in nearby rows looked up from their drinks, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Catherine's composure cracked for just a second. "But sir, your seat is in the premium single row with extra space and privacy," she stammered. "Are you sure you want to?" Tom leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I didn't ask for extra space. I asked for the seat." Rebecca felt her throat tighten. Was this actually happening? Catherine's polite mask was beginning to slip. This wasn't part of her carefully maintained order. In first class, passengers were supposed to remain in their carefully assigned categories. The wealthy, the powerful, the important. And then there was Rebecca, a woman who in Catherine's mind didn't belong. She forced a laugh, trying to regain control. "Mr. Cruise, I assure you, this section is much more comfortable for you. It's designed for..." Tom raised an eyebrow. "For people who meet certain proportions." Catherine's face flushed red. Rebecca, stunned, felt her heart racing. No one had ever stood up for her like this. And certainly not someone like Tom Cruise. The businessman next to her shifted again, suddenly hyper-aware of the unfolding tension. The murmuring around them grew louder. "Is there a problem, miss?" Tom asked, his tone still polite, but with an unmistakable edge of authority. Catherine's lips parted, but no words came out. She was trapped. This wasn't some random passenger she could brush aside. This was Hollywood royalty, a man who could get her fired with one phone call. "Oh, of course not, Mr. Cruise," she finally said, forcing a smile. "If you wish to switch seats, I'll make the arrangements." Her voice wavered, the realization of her own mistake beginning to dawn on her. As she turned to reassign the seating, Tom leaned toward Rebecca, his voice dropping to a gentle tone only she could hear. "You good?" Rebecca's lips trembled, a mix of gratitude and disbelief washing over her. She swallowed, nodding. "Yeah, thank you." Tom smiled, then winked. "Don't thank me yet." Rebecca had no idea what that meant, but something told her this was just the beginning. Catherine stormed back toward the service area, her jaw clenched so tight it could crack. Her perfectly curated first-class environment had just been disrupted in the worst possible way. Tom Cruise had just humiliated her, and in front of people who actually mattered. She yanked out her tablet, her fingers tapping aggressively as she pulled up the seating chart. Switching seats was simple, but the power dynamics had shifted, and that was something she couldn't tolerate. From across the aisle, The businessman in the pressed navy suit leaned slightly toward Rebecca, his face unreadable. "I hope you realize how lucky you are," he muttered under his breath, pretending to adjust his tie. "Most people in your situation don't get that kind of privilege." Rebecca's stomach twisted. There it was. That condescending tone. That unspoken assumption that someone like her was undeserving of this seat, of Tom's kindness, of even existing in this space. Her fingers dug into the armrests, but before she could say anything, Tom turned his head slightly. "What was that?" His voice was light, almost casual. But there was a sharpness beneath it, a warning. The businessman immediately tensed, his fingers pausing mid-adjustment on his tie. "Nothing," he said quickly, eyes snapping back to his tablet. "Just making an observation." Tom let out a slow breath, shaking his head before glancing at Rebecca. People love to observe things they don't understand. Rebecca felt her chest tighten. Why was he doing this? Why did he care? She had spent her whole life shrinking in moments like these, making herself small to avoid confrontation. But Tom? He wasn't shrinking for anyone. Catherine returned, her fake professionalism back in place, but Rebecca could see it, the barely concealed frustration beneath her practiced smile. "Mr. Cruz, your seat has been reassigned. If you'd like to move now." Tom unbuckled his belt and stood up effortlessly, towering over her just slightly. His presence was commanding, not because he was trying to be intimidating, he simply was. As he moved toward Rebecca's seat, a flight attendant in her early 20s, her name tag reading Emily, rushed over. Unlike Catherine, Emily had a look of concern, not judgment. "Sir, I just wanted to say I think it's really kind what you're doing," she whispered nervously. "I saw what happened earlier, and I just wanted to say it's wrong. What she did to this passenger was wrong." Catherine's eyes snapped to Emily, sharp as a knife. "That will be enough, Emily," she hissed. But Tom? He simply grinned. "You got guts, kid," he said to Emily, then looked at Rebecca. "I like her." Rebecca let out a soft laugh, her first real smile since boarding the plane. But just as the tension seemed to settle, a new voice cut through the cabin. Excuse me, flight attendant." A woman from a few rows back waved her manicured hand, her expensive gold bracelets jingling as she gestured impatiently. Catherine turned, her fake smile reappearing like clockwork. "Yes, ma'am? How can I assist you?" The woman crossed her arms. "I paid for first-class seating for a reason. I don't see why seats should be changed at random. It's unfair to the rest of us who expect a certain standard." Several other passengers murmured in agreement. The businessman next to Rebecca smirked, clearly pleased. Rebecca felt her face heat up all over again. She wanted to disappear, to vanish into her seat, and pretend none of this was happening. She hated being the center of attention. Tom, however, remained completely unfazed. He slowly turned toward the woman, his expression unreadable. "You're upset because I changed seats?" His tone was light, but Rebecca could tell he was testing her. The woman hesitated, not expecting a direct challenge. "It's not just that," she backtracked quickly. "I just think certain seating arrangements are there for a reason." "Right." Tom nodded, rubbing his jaw thoughtfully. "So let me get this straight. You're not upset that people switch seats. You're upset about who's switching seats." Silence. The woman's lips parted as if she wanted to protest, but she couldn't. Not without exposing her true reasoning. Tom smirked, shaking his head. "I've worked in Hollywood for decades, and trust me, I know what fake outrage looks like." A soft chuckle rippled through the cabin. Even Emily, the young flight attendant, had to hide a smile. The woman turned red, gripping her designer handbag. She had lost. Catherine, standing stiffly at the front, looked like she wanted to throw something. Rebecca exhaled, finally releasing a breath she didn't know she had been holding. But just when she thought the worst was over, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have some unexpected turbulence up ahead. We're asking all passengers to remain seated and fasten their seatbelts as we navigate through it. Flight attendants, please take your seats immediately." The cabin lights flickered slightly as a low rumble shuddered through the aircraft. Rebecca stiffened, gripping the armrest. She had never done well with turbulence. Tom, now settled in his new seat beside her, glanced at her hands. He could see how tightly she was holding on. Without hesitation, he reached over and placed his hand gently on top of hers. "It's all good," he murmured, his voice steady. "I've flown through worse." Rebecca hesitated for a moment, then slowly nodded, her fingers loosening slightly under his touch. She had no idea how this flight would end. But one thing was certain. Everything had changed. The aircraft lurched suddenly, sending a jolt through the cabin. Gasps filled the air as passengers clutched their armrests. The captain's voice crackled back over the intercom. "We've hit some unexpected turbulence, folks. Nothing to worry about. But please keep your seatbelts fastened." Cabin crew remained seated. Rebecca's breath hitched as her knuckles turned white, her grip tightening on the armrest again. Tom noticed immediately. "Breathe," he said calmly. "In through your nose, out through your mouth." She tried, but the shaking of the plane made her feel like her stomach was twisting into knots. Tom, still keeping his hand lightly over hers, chuckled softly. This is nothing. I've done my own stunts at 30,000 feet. One time, I literally hung off the side of a plane while it took off. And I didn't even have a seatbelt." Rebecca blinked at him. Was he joking? Tom grinned. "Google it later." Despite herself, Rebecca let out a shaky laugh. The tension in her body eased just a little. The businessman across the aisle let out an exaggerated sigh, flipping a page of his Wall Street Journal, as if the turbulence, and everything else happening, was beneath him. "You'd think they'd have better pilots for a first-class flight," he muttered. Tom's eyes flickered to him briefly, but he didn't engage. Instead, he kept his focus on Rebecca. "You doing okay?" he asked. Rebecca nodded quickly, even though she wasn't sure if she was lying. The turbulence calmed after a few minutes, and the passengers started relaxing again. The murmuring in the cabin resumed, and flight attendants slowly returned to their duties. Catherine reappeared, but something had changed. She no longer carried herself with the same smug confidence. Her lips were pressed together tightly, and the way she held her tablet seemed almost defensive. She wasn't done. "Mr. Cruz," she started, her voice forced into pleasantness. "If I may." Tom turned to her slowly, arching an eyebrow. Catherine hesitated, then smiled tightly. "As you're aware, we have policies regarding passenger comfort. I would be happy to offer Ms. Miller here." She motioned toward Rebecca with a barely concealed sneer. "A seat in a section where she might be more at ease." Rebecca's stomach plummeted. The shame hit her all over again. Before she could say a word, Tom leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. "You know Catherine," he said, drawing out her name just enough to make her visibly stiffen. "I've traveled all over the world. Hundreds of flights. And I've seen all kinds of service." She forced a smile. "I'm sure you have, sir." Tom nodded, then tilted his head slightly. "And in all my years of flying first class, I've never seen a flight attendant so concerned about a paying passenger's comfort that she's willing to humiliate them repeatedly just to make a point." The air seemed to leave the cabin. Rebecca could feel all eyes on them now. Catherine blinked rapidly, her posture going rigid. "That is not my intent, sir." Tom gave her a slow, knowing look. "That's exactly your intent." The businessman snorted under his breath, but when Tom's gaze snapped toward him, he suddenly seemed very invested in his newspaper again. Rebecca felt her pulse in her ears. Never in her life had someone defended her like this. Publicly, boldly, without hesitation. Catherine's face flushed deep red, her fingers tightening around her tablet. She was losing control of the situation, and she knew it. Rebecca finally found her voice. "I don't need another seat." Catherine's jaw twitched, but she nodded quickly, mumbling, "Of course." Then, without another word, she turned and stalked toward the front of the cabin. Rebecca let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Tom stretched his legs out and grinned at her. "You handled that well." Rebecca snorted. "You handled that." Tom shrugged, his eyes twinkling. "Team effort." But just when Rebecca thought they might finally be in the clear, the businessman spoke again. "You really think you're a hero, don't you?" His voice was low and bitter. Rebecca's heart sank. Tom, however, looked amused. He turned to face the man fully, tilting his head slightly. "I don't know," Tom said, his voice light. "You tell me." The businessman scoffed. "You think standing up for her changes anything? That it makes you some kind of savior?" Rebecca's hands curled into fists. She had heard this before. People like him didn't just look down on her. They resented her for existing. Tom studied the man for a long moment, then smiled. But there was no warmth in it. "Tell me something," Tom said, voice still smooth as silk. "Why does my kindness bother you?" The businessman stiffened. "It doesn't." "Really?" Tom's grin widened. "Because you've been itching to say something since I switched seats. You keep waiting for the moment where you get to put her back in her place. Like it personally offends you that she's here. So again, why does my kindness bother you?" The businessman's mouth opened, then shut. For the first time since the flight began, he had no response. Tom held his gaze for a second longer, then turned back to Rebecca, completely unfazed. "Anyway, let's order some snacks." He picked up the menu. "You ever had the first-class chocolate truffles? They're life-changing." Rebecca laughed, genuinely laughed. And for the first time since she boarded this flight, she felt like she belonged. The turbulence had finally settled, but the tension in the cabin had not. Catherine lingered near the service area, her face tight with frustration. The businessman had gone silent, his posture stiff, but the air around him was thick with bitterness. Meanwhile, Rebecca still felt like she was processing everything. She had spent her whole life fading into the background, trying to avoid moments exactly like this. But Tom Cruise had done the opposite. He had refused to let her shrink. And now, for the first time in her life, she didn't want to shrink either. A soft chime rang through the cabin, followed by the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're approaching smoother skies, and we'd like to thank you for your patience. In just a few minutes, we will begin meal service." The tension in the air seemed to ease slightly. A few passengers adjusted their seats, returning to their usual distractions. Catherine, still seething, snatched up a tray and stalked toward Rebecca and Tom's row. She forced a plastic smile. "Would you care for a drink, Mr. Cruise?" Tom didn't look up from his menu. "A glass of water, thanks." Catherine nodded curtly, then turned to Rebecca, barely concealing her irritation. "And for you?" she asked, voice clipped. Rebecca, feeling a new kind of fire in her chest, lifted her chin slightly. "Actually," she said, her voice steady, "I'll have champagne." Catherine blinked. Tom's grin spread slowly. Catherine's fingers tightened around her tray. She had expected Rebecca to cower, to keep her head down. But now, she was standing her ground. "Of course," Catherine said through gritted teeth, then turned and stormed away. Rebecca exhaled, her heart hammering. But when she looked at Tom, he was already watching her, his signature megawatt grin lighting up his face. "That," he said, "was legendary." Rebecca laughed. She actually laughed. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she belonged. As Catherine returned with the drinks, her movements stiff and mechanical, Tom raised his glass. "To standing tall," he said simply. Rebecca smiled, clinking her glass against his. For the first time in her life, she wasn't apologizing for taking up space. She was owning it. Rebecca took a deep breath, letting the cool bubbles of the champagne tickle her throat as she set her glass down. The weight of the last few hours settled over her, but for once, it didn't feel crushing. It felt empowering. She glanced at Tom, who had already leaned back in his seat, completely at ease. His presence had turned an unbearable situation into an unforgettable one. Catherine, meanwhile, continued her service, but it was clear to everyone that she had been thoroughly put in her place. No more passive-aggressive remarks. No more attempts to humiliate Rebecca. She moved with the rigid politeness of someone who had lost a battle. Rebecca would be lying if she said she wasn't enjoying it. As she sipped her drink, the businessman across the aisle, who had spent most of the flight steeping in quiet resentment, cleared his throat. "You must be feeling pretty proud of yourself," he muttered. Rebecca's fingers stilled on the stem of her glass. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze. Not with fear. Not with embarrassment. But with something new, confidence. "Why would I be proud?" she asked, her voice smooth. "I didn't do anything special. I just sat in my seat." Tom let out a low chuckle, clearly enjoying this. The businessman's jaw clenched. "People like you always play the victim." Rebecca tilted her head. "People like me?" The businessman looked like he regretted his words instantly. He shifted uncomfortably, looking for a way to retreat. Tom, however, was not about to let him off the hook. Go ahead, Tom said, his tone casual but pointed. Explain what you mean by people like her. We're all listening. A few nearby passengers turned their heads, intrigued. The businessman sputtered. I just mean, this whole thing has been blown out of proportion. Tom nodded thoughtfully. Right. So to be clear, a woman paid for a first-class seat, got harassed for sitting in it, and now you're upset that she, what? Didn't apologize for existing. The businessman had no response. He shifted in his seat, suddenly very interested in the seatbelt sign. Rebecca watched his discomfort for a moment before speaking again. But this time, it wasn't with hesitation. You know, I used to let people like you make me feel small. She said it softly, but there was steel underneath. But now I realize something. People like you don't actually have power over me. You just count on me not realizing mine. Tom grinned, like she had just nailed a stunt sequence on the first take. The businessman muttered something under his breath, and looked away. For the first time in her life, Rebecca didn't feel like she had to look away too. Instead, she turned back to Tom and exhaled. That felt really good. Tom laughed. I bet it did. Rebecca stared out the window at the vast blue sky. The view looked different now, like something full of possibilities instead of limitations. She had spent her whole life trying to disappear. But today, for the first time, she had learned how to take up space. And it felt damn good. As the plane cruised smoothly through the sky, Rebecca let herself breathe. For years, she had avoided moments like this, confrontation, attention, being seen. But now she felt something new. Something that made her sit a little taller. The weight of judgment had always felt like a chain around her shoulders. But today she had learned something powerful. She was never the problem. The problem was people who thought she didn't belong. And she wasn't going to carry their burden anymore. Tom took a sip of water, then glanced at her. So tell me something. Rebecca turned to him. Yeah. What are you gonna do differently after this flight? His voice was casual, but his eyes held something deeper. ****. Rebecca thought for a long moment. Finally she smiled. I'm done making myself small. Tom grinned. That's what I like to hear. From across the cabin, Emily, the young flight attendant, gave Rebecca a subtle thumbs up. Not all heroes wore capes. Some just stood up when it mattered. Rebecca smiled back. The rest of the flight felt different. Not because the turbulence had passed, but because something inside her had settled. When the plane finally landed in Los Angeles, Rebecca gathered her things. As she stepped into the aisle, she caught one final look at Catherine. The flight attendant looked exhausted, her usual cool composure long gone. But Rebecca didn't feel sorry for her. Instead of lowering her head and rushing past, Rebecca walked confidently, her shoulders back, her head high. Catherine's eyes flickered to hers, and for the first time, she looked away first. Rebecca stepped off the plane, different than when she had boarded. Not in size, not in status, but in power. She had spent her whole life fitting into the spaces people allowed her. Now she was going to take up space on her own terms. Tom stepped up beside her, sliding on his sunglasses. You know, I think this is the start of your main character era. Rebecca laughed. You know what? I think you're right. And for the first time in her life, she truly believed it. The end.